Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Monica Alba in Washington, where the Trump administration is downplaying concerns that the ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran is unraveling. Despite Iran's renewed aggression in the Strait of Hormuz, armed clashes with U.S. forces, and strikes in the region, as gas prices continue to rise and the price of oil remains above $100 a barrel. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is wrapping up a briefing at the White House with reporters where he was pressed about the status of the war in Iran and the current U.S. operations to guide vessels through the strait. He told reporters that the war was, quote, over, but the turmoil in the strait was not.
This is not an offensive operation. This is a defensive operation. And what that means is very simple. There's no shooting unless we're shot at first. Okay? We're not attacking them. But if they're attacking us or they're attacking a ship, you need to respond to that. Look, the time's come for Iran to make a sensible choice. And it's not easy for them to do that, obviously, because they have a fracture in their own leadership system. And apart from that, I mean, the top people in that government are, to say the least, they're insane in the brain. And so we need to address that. Operation is over. Epic Fury, as the president notified Congress, we're done with that stage of it.
Secretary Rubio was adamant that Iran cannot be allowed to normalize control of the strait, tacitly acknowledging that Iran does in fact have control of the vital waterway, in direct contrast to what the president has said in recent weeks about the U.S. controlling the strait.
These guys have shut down the Straits of Hormuz. This is what Iran is saying. We will shut down the straits. No one can go through. No country in the world can go through unless we allow you to go through, and you have to pay us. But our ships can go through, meaning the Iranian ships, as much as they want. That's crazy.
This comes after we saw in this briefing today with the president an incredibly high gas prices. All of the news from the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, who also held a briefing today. General Kane telling reporters that since the ceasefire began, Iran has attacked U.S. forces more than 10 times, but saying those attacks are below the threshold of restarting major combat operations. Here's more from the Pentagon briefing.
You said that the attacks by Iran so far are below the threshold of restarting major combat operations. What is that threshold?
The threshold of restarting is a political decision above my pay grade. What I'll say is it's low harassing fire right now.
The last 24 hours or so, Iran's fired at us, we fired at Iran. Just going to ask you more directly, is the ceasefire over?
No, the ceasefire is not over. Ultimately, the president's going to make a decision whether anything were to escalate into a violation of a ceasefire.
And today, President Trump would not say what would constitute a violation of that ceasefire.
What do they need to do to violate the ceasefire?
Well, you'll find out, because I'll let you know. They know what to do, and they know what to do. They know what not to do, more importantly, actually. As you know, the blockade's been amazing. It's like a piece of steel. Nobody's going to challenge the blockade. And I think it's working out very well. They play games, but let me just tell you, they want to make a deal. And who wouldn't? When your military is totally gone, we could do anything we want to them.
And despite the president's optimism about the U.S. naval blockade, transit through the Strait of Hormuz remains at a near standstill, with only one vessel making it through the channel today, according to analysts. And with so much of the world's oil supply frozen, gas prices continue to climb, reaching a new high during the war. Average prices now hitting $4.48 a gallon, up 50%. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, for the second consecutive day, the United Arab Emirates says it came under attack by missiles and drones from Iran. Tehran denies it carried out the attack, but yesterday, Iran's foreign minister warned in a post on social media that the UAE should be wary of, quote, being dragged back into quagmire by ill wishers. Joining me now is NBC News senior White House correspondent Garrett Haake, who was just in that briefing with Secretary Rubio. We have NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube and NBC News military analyst, retired Army Colonel Steve Warren. Thank you all for starting us off. Garrett, I want to go to you on what we just heard from the secretary there. What stood out to you?
Well, I think the main thing was the effort to reframe this Project Freedom as a benevolent action of the United States, the idea that the U.S. is trying to help out allies and partners all over the world, and as a humanitarian action for sailors who've been trapped in the Persian Gulf since this war started, not as a military exercise as a consequence of Iran shutting the strait because of the war that the U.S. has been engaged on in Iran. I mean, it was a reframing around this new goal of opening the strait, and the Secretary trying to link that to, what if Iran had a nuclear weapon and this desire to keep the strait closed? What a disaster that would be. To me, it was just sort of a telling marker of how far we've come in the almost 10 weeks since this conflict began. That was all about preventing Iran from having a nuclear weapon in a time where the strait was not even something that most Americans could find on a map, to now, on this day, the Secretary of State spending almost an hour talking about the importance of reopening a global waterway that was, before this conflict, open.
Yeah, having no issue at all compared to what we're seeing now. And Garrett, there was some mixed messaging that we've even seen just over the course of today from the Trump administration, insisting that the ceasefire does remain in place. So what is the status of negotiations right now between the U.S. and Iran, according to Secretary Rubio?
It's a great question. The country's top diplomat, the Secretary of State, put some distance between himself and those negotiations, saying that this was something that, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff have been heading up. He criticized Iran's leaders at one point as being insane. He called them radical clerics, and he talked about the idea of a diplomatic solution as a conditional. He said if there could be a diplomatic outcome. None of that suggests a great deal of confidence in negotiations that haven't taken place in person in almost a month, and with the Secretary of State basically keeping an arm's length from something that you perhaps would not have heard that same kind of tone if he were optimistic that a deal could be reached.
Yeah, Secretary Rubio not participating in any of those negotiations coming up. He has another big trip coming up, though. He is set to travel to Italy and the Vatican. He was asked about that, and of course it comes as President Trump and the Pope have been feuding back and forth, including specifically over the war in Iran. So how much of the Trump administration's foreign policy might loom over that expected meeting?
It'll certainly be an element. I mean, the Secretary took some pains to say that this was a trip that was scheduled before that recent back and forth between the Pope and the President. This wasn't about that directly. He is himself a practicing Roman Catholic, and I think provided a little bit of a different tone in his comments about the Pope, certainly, than what we've heard from President Trump, and said there's things he wants to work with the Vatican on, like aid to Cuba, like religious freedom in Africa. So I think you certainly saw a degree of smoothing over of what had been somewhat of a strained relationship between the Vatican and the White House. That's something that certainly the Secretary is in a good position to continue to do while he's there. But again, the Pope is unlikely to back off his message of peace. It's core to his message as Pope. It's core to the last Pope's message. This is not like anything new from the Vatican here. So I wouldn't expect to hear Pope Leo change his tune in opposition to this and all wars just because the Secretary of State's visiting him in the Vatican.
Garrett Haake kicking us off from the White House briefing room. Thank you, Garrett. And Courtney, I do want to turn to you now because the Pentagon did also have a briefing today. So what more did we learn about U.S. military operations and the status of the ceasefire from their perspective?
Yeah, I mean, despite the fact that President Trump in a radio interview late yesterday declined to say whether the ceasefire had been broken or not by the U.S. and Iran exchanging fire near the Strait of Hormuz yesterday, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth was adamant about it and said, no, the ceasefire has not been broken. So interesting for him to sort of take a step ahead of where the president was willing to go on the same issue. We learned a little bit more about exactly how this Project Freedom is going to operate. So far, we're still only aware of the 2 U.S. flagships that have transited through the strait, through that U.S. passageway. They transited through yesterday. Both were U.S. flagged. As of now, I've just checked again. We're not aware of any additional that have gone through, despite the fact that both the military and the Secretary of Defense himself said that there are dozens of countries and shipping companies that have come forward saying that they're interested in using this passageway. Iran did try to attack both of those ships using drones, missiles, and small boats, these small fast boats. The U.S. military was able to intercept the drones and the missiles and fire on those fast boats, blowing them up from attack helicopters in the air. So at this point, the big question is, what's going to happen going forward? Will additional ships come forward and use that passageway? And what will happen? Will they go through without any kind of provocations?
And as we noted in the open, only one vessel was even able to transit the Strait of Hormuz today. So how is the Pentagon justifying its claim that this operation to guide vessels through the passageway is working?
So they did get through, 2 of them through yesterday. So they're looking at that as a success. And I've been asking officials today, what's the latest? What's happening with more ships going through? And they say, we're working through. There's all these people who are coming forward. But we've not gotten any specifics, despite asking many times. The reporters in the briefing just there were also trying to press Secretary of State Marco Rubio about what countries have come forward and expressed any kind of interest in this as well. But he also declined to provide any kind of specifics or give any sort of scope or scale of what that might look like.
And Court, we ask you this all the time, but it's so helpful to remind viewers, because as we're talking about the ceasefire still holding, just remind us, what is the current U.S. military posture right now in the region?
So there's 3 separate operations there right now, or missions, really. But many of the forces there are overlapping and in some cases are really assigned to all 3 of them. So there's Operation Epic Fury, despite the fact that we are hearing from Trump administration officials that is over or terminated. In fact, the military component of that continues. The military sees that operation as being on pause right now. Next, we have this ongoing naval blockade that's been going on for several weeks. There are a number of different ships. There are dozens of U.S. military aircraft assigned to that. And then now we have this Project Freedom. What's confusing about this is these are the Pentagon has made it very clear that they see these as 3 completely separate and distinct missions or operations. But again, the ships, the aircraft, the personnel, many of them are simultaneously assigned to multiple missions at the same time. It's just a matter of which one they are actively engaging in at any given moment. That's why the situation is very confusing right now.
Thank you, Courtney and Kube, for breaking down the complexities of all of that. Appreciate it. And I want to continue that conversation specifically with Colonel Steve Warren, who is here on set with me. And as we did mention, General Kane said today that Iran has attacked U.S. forces 10 times, but that is below the threshold of what they would use to potentially start combat operations again. So what kind of message does that send to Iran about what it would take to violate the ceasefire? Does this mean that they can kind of test and take it further and further each time to see how far they can get?
Yeah, it's interesting. The president added on top of that, didn't he, when he said the Iranians will know when it happens, right? So I think they will. The Iranians will continue to probe. They'll continue to press to try to find out where those lines are. And this is common, right? In ceasefires, often what you see is this sort of jockeying back and forth, a violation here, a violation there, but nothing that will cause the entire thing to blow up. Is
it clear to you what an actual violation would look like? What do you think that threshold would be?
Well, I think the threshold would be if something gets through, right? So, they fired several missiles, some drones. We managed to shoot those all down. If something gets through and does damage to an American warship, I think that'll probably flip the switch.
And the Trump administration has continued to say and tout that this operation of Project Freedom has been successful so far. But one global shipping giant told NBC News that its risk assessment remains unchanged and the strait remains, as they view it, closed for transit. So is there a limit to what the military can do to reassure these shipping companies that it could be safe to go through?
Yeah, I think so. What's going to happen, and this happens in every operation, it will take a little bit of time to generate the combat power, to get the systems in place, to get things sort of rocking and rolling, so to speak, right? And once that happens, I think we'll start to see confidence build. What the military has done is create this lane of sort of safe passage. Admiral Brad Cooper, the commander of CENTCOM, called it a thick layer of defense. So it's aircraft, it's ships, it's subsurface, it's everything, creating this barrier, this umbrella over the lane. Once ship captains, mariners start to feel comfortable with that, I think you'll see increased traffic through there.
So, Colonel Warren, what you're describing, does that make it seem like what we're seeing now could become the status quo in the Strait of Hormuz? Is this something that U.S. military operations could continue to support for how long?
It could be. And in fact, it's a strategic move, right? If we can open that strait, if this works, then the United States military can continue that blockade on Iran pretty much forever. So if this works, it'll go on until the Iranians finally collapse, I believe. It will take time. It will take energy. It will take effort. The Navy can do it. We just have to be patient.
And the way that the U.S. military has been talking about Operation Epic Fury as sort of one thing that has, quote, terminated for legal purposes, but the naval blockade and what we're talking about with Project Freedom, those are happening on different tracks, right? How should people understand and separate the two?
It's tricky. It's really hard sometimes to separate them out. A lot of the separation that the military and the Pentagon and the White House are doing really are for legal purposes. I think to the common bystander, looking at all of this as one big operation is perfectly reasonable. What we're trying to do is get Iran to do something. And once that happens, the whole thing will end.
Colonel Warren, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.